You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another Top 10 video. So I recently held a poll on my community tab to see what my next video should be. Don't worry, all of the options will get made eventually, I just want to know which one to focus on first. And so, at the moment of this recording, the winner is my top 10 favorite manga. And that is at 40% of the vote, with the second place being top 10 video game bosses at 33%, and unpopular horror opinions coming in last at 27%. So it's fairly split. So it's not like any of them were particularly uninteresting, it's just people overwhelmingly want the manga top 10 first, which I completely get. So we're gonna do my manga top 10 today. And a couple rules here, not nearly as many as anime, but one thing to keep in mind, I have not read anywhere near as much manga as I have seen anime. So this list was a lot easier to narrow down, but just because of that doesn't mean that it won't change over time, because I'm still reading new stuff. I'm not going to make any restrictions as far as authors and limiting a number of stuff for them, because I don't really think that would be genuine, and since I've read a lot less manga, I feel like that's less of an issue than it was with some other things. But there will obviously be Gonagai on here, as you can expect, but I think my number one will surprise you, because many of you probably think you know what it is, although I have mentioned it before in other videos, what my actual favorite manga is, but we'll get into that. Before we jump into the top 10, one other thing I do want to mention is one rule I do have is it has to be a manga that I've read a significant amount of. I don't have to have necessarily read the whole thing, but I have to have read enough to make a judgment. And so because of that, things like Berserk aren't on this list, simply because I've only read a couple of chapters. Same thing with Claymore and a few others. That said, let's hop into it. So at number 10, we have Susano, also known as Susano-o, which is an underrated Gonagai manga, in my opinion. Susano is about this guy who joins a psychic club at his high school, and then he learns that he has these psychic abilities, and he begins to use them. And then some bad stuff happens to his girlfriend, and it awakens something dark within him, and it turns out he's like the reincarnation of this like ancient god-type thing called King Dread. And it gives him a lot of crazy abilities. I haven't read the whole thing, to be perfectly honest, but I've read a good chunk. I've probably read about half of it. But it's a very underrated Gonagai series, never got released in the US, never got adapted into an anime, and has only been translated by fans. But nevertheless, I've liked what I've read a whole hell of a lot, and I think the characters were very interesting, and I definitely think it's a unfairly overlooked Gonagai series. Alright, number 9, we have Man Wonderland. Now, Man Wonderland, if you recall, is in my top 10 favorite anime of all time as well, though the manga is significantly better than the anime, because the anime leaves out a lot of important plot points from the manga, as well as just doesn't finish it. It just stops halfway through, and it's incredibly infuriating. But the manga is great. It has a fantastic ending. But if you don't know what it's about, Man Wonderland is about a high school student named Ganta, who gets framed for the murder of his entire class by this evil being called the Wretched Egg, also known as the Red Man. And the Wretched Egg kills his entire class, and he gets blamed for it and gets sent to this super crazy prison called Man Wonderland that's also an obstacle course and has an arena where the people on death row battle to the death. And anyone who's exposed to the Wretched Egg can use their blood as a weapon, with different abilities for each one, so it's really cool to watch that as well. Again, the manga actually has a satisfying ending, and actually has a lot of cool concepts that just weren't in the anime, so the manga is significantly better. Alright, number 8, we have basically anything written by Junji Ito. He doesn't really do series a whole hell of a lot. He's done Uzumaki, but I haven't read that. And he's done Tomi, which I've only read a little bit of. But overall, I really like Junji Ito's style. He does a lot of really creepy, just over-the-top, scary designs with his art. And the stories themselves are pretty interesting too, but the art is really what sells it. Like, Junji Ito's style is fucking terrifying. I absolutely love it. It's some of the best creepy effects I've ever seen in a manga, and that's why Junji Ito himself is actually my third favorite manga author, my second being Toshio Maeda, and my first being Gonagai. But yeah, I love Junji Ito's work. It's hard to pick a specific one, so that's why I'm just kind of lumping them together, because again, his actual series I haven't read a whole hell of a lot of. Like, there are some recurring characters in some of his one-offs, but that said, I just think his work overall is really good. Alright, number 7, we have Cutie Honey. Now, as far as the manga goes, I've only read the original Cutie Honey all the way through. I've read a little bit of Cutie Honey 90 and a tiny bit of Cutie Honey A Go-Go, although I do own Cutie Honey A Go-Go, I just haven't read it. But Cutie Honey is great. It's one of Gonagai's big 3 stories. It's about an android whose father gets murdered by this mysterious organization known as Panther Claw, who want to take this device that's inside of her so that they can use it for their own abilities. The story itself is, it's like a hybrid between like a magical girl and battle shonen manga. The manga and anime are actually pretty similar, which is I know, weird to have to say that, but for a lot of Go Nagai's early work, that wasn't necessarily the case. But I think Cutie Honey actually does the manga pretty well justice with the anime. But the manga I do still think is ultimately a little bit better in many regards. Though I do think I prefer Naojiro over Naoko, because not only is Naojiro more similar to his Abashiri family counterpart, but on top of that, he's also related to the Hayamis rather than just being a delinquent girl at school like Naoko is. But either way, I do think that the manga is still really good. And I do think there are a lot of elements in the manga that are better than the anime. It's just the anime does have a lot of cool stuff, too, that isn't in the manga. But Cutie Honey's great. It definitely earns its place on this list. I absolutely love it. Alright, number 6. Eurotsuki Doji, the one Toshio Maeda manga that actually made this list. Now, I have read the Love Blue Girl manga, at least the first volume of it, but I haven't read anything past the first volume, and I didn't really want to put it in a place on this list that would take up another place, though I do still really like Love Blue Girl, so it's an honorable mention at the very least. But Eurotsuki Doji is one of those weird cases where the anime is actually significantly better than the manga, but despite that, I do still think the manga is really good. There's a few different things that I'm not the biggest fan of in it. For instance, in the manga, some of the sex scenes feel a little forced, no pun intended given the nature of the series, but some of them kind of drag out, and I think that it was a little bit more balanced in the anime with the story and the hentai. The manga, though it does have, in my opinion, maybe a little too many sex scenes, I mean, it's a hentai, so fair, I do still think the story is really interesting. I think that a lot of interesting concepts are in the manga that didn't make it into the anime, but I do ultimately think that the anime is better, and also the ending to the manga isn't anything great. I actually have a lot of issues with the ending, but this is a spoiler-free video, so we're not going to get into that. But Eurotsuki Doji is pretty great. It's typically known as, like, the first tentacle hentai, and while there were, like, tentacle erotica in, like, old-school Japanese art, it is the first conventional tentacle hentai. If you've read the Wikipedia article, you'd be led to believe that there are no tentacle scenes in the manga, which is just patently wrong. I don't know why they insist that. They get a lot of things wrong. They also say that there's not 3 realms in the manga on Wikipedia, which is also patently false. There are 3 realms. I've read the whole manga. I know that these things are in it. With the tentacle one, you can maybe make the argument that because a lot of these tentacles aren't literal tentacles, maybe that's why they don't count it, because, you know, it's like tongues that stretch out, or like tails that resemble tentacles. But there are some things that do look more like tentacles. Like, there are tentacles that are like dicks, but they're like tentacle-like. I think to say that it's not tentacle is a little bit unfair, just because it's not traditional. That said, it is definitely like the thing that popularized it, and Toshio Maeda is known as the tentacle master. He wants his grave to say that. Apart from all of that, it has a really great dark story about this ancient demon god to be resurrected and to unite the 3 realms, or some other thing like that. The Overfiend's actual goals are kind of kept hidden. They say that it's to unite the 3 realms, but then as it goes on, you find out more and more that there is a darker motive behind it. I don't want to spoil it again. I will say that the manga only covers the stuff from Eurotsuki Doji 1, Legend of the Overfiend. It doesn't have any of the stuff that would be in the later animes, such as Legend of the Demon Womb, Return of the Overfiend, Inferno Road, or the final chapter. Those were all made up specifically for the anime. So the manga is actually relatively short. It's only 6 volumes that were later switched into 4 omnibus volumes when it got released in the US by Faku. But yeah, it's a really cool dark demon manga. The anime's better. I do think they made the characters more likable in the anime, and I think the manga does get overlooked a lot. But the anime, in my opinion, is better in this case. But still, this was still good enough to make it to number 6 on my list. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was number 6 on my actual anime list as well. So there you go. Number 5. Here's one that I'm sure you all expected to be on this list somewhere, and that is Violence Jack. Violence Jack is Go Nagai's longest manga, or at least one of his longest manga. It's certainly the longest one with any connection to Devilman. Running at 31 volumes in its original run, and later being condensed into 18 special edition volumes that combine 2 volumes apiece, typically, or so. Violence Jack is great. It's a Go Nagai epic, where it brings in characters from multiple Go Nagai works. There's the obvious connection to Devilman. Again, I'm not going to spoil any of that. The characters from Susano, actually, so my number 10 pick on this list, actually do appear in the Hyper Grappler arc of Violence Jack. They have characters recur from basically every major Go Nagai thing in it. You got Abashiri family characters, Cutie Honey characters, Devilman characters, Demon Lord Dante to an extent, with a few references and callbacks to him there. The Demon Prince Enma characters. Like, it brings in basically every prominent Go Nagai work into one post-apocalyptic shit show, and I absolutely love it. It gets crazier and more over the top with each volume, so the plot starts to go fucking insane in the later volumes with all these universes merging together and bringing all this shit in, but I absolutely love going along for the ride, and every second of it is absolutely fascinating. If I were to recommend a Go Nagai fan one manga of Go Nagai, it would be Violence Jack, simply because it is the quintessential Go Nagai manga, bringing in most of his characters. It also was one of the original post-apocalyptic mangas. It came before Mad Max or Fist of the North Star or anything like that, so I definitely think it had some influence in the genre, coming out in 1973. It's fucking great, I love it. It gets overlooked because a lot of people think of how graphic it is based on the OVA trilogy, and granted, the manga's more graphic when you get later on. The earlier chapters really aren't that graphic, but once you get, like, post-Evil Town, it gets really fucked up. But I love it. It's great. I absolutely love Violence Jack. Alright, number 4, one that I've talked about a lot on the channel before as well, and was in my top 10 anime, although it was lower on that list, or higher, depending on how you want to look at it. Basically, on this list, it's number 4. It was number, I think, 3 on my top 10 anime list, but it's Death Note. I absolutely love Death Note. It's the story of this guy named Light Yagami who finds a notebook that was dropped by a death god, that if he writes someone's name in it, they'll die. And it becomes this perpetual game of cat and mouse between Light wiping the world of criminals, and then he himself being tracked down by the world's greatest detective, an eccentric man known as L. Death Note was what got me into anime, and it was actually like the first manga I actually read. So it definitely holds a special place for that, being the first manga I read, and one of the first animes I watched. It wasn't the first, I think I watched Pokemon and Dragon Ball long before that. But it was my gateway to anime. Death Note's great, it's very intense and dramatic and dark. It's not very action-packed, it's much more about the tension in the game of cat and mouse and them constantly one-upping each other. That's not to say it's completely devoid of action, because there is a decent amount here and there, but it's not like a typical battle shonen. There's no, like, actual fights, really. There is a little bit of violence, but really not that much. Like, some of the deaths can be kind of graphic sometimes, but compared to some of the other stuff on this list, it's definitely nowhere near as violent. And the violence is certainly not a main feature of it. It's much more about God complex of Light Yagami and the detective skills of L. Alright, number 3, we have Elfin Lead. Now this is also obviously on my top 10 anime list. I think it was my number 2 place on that. And Elfin Lead was my favorite anime that wasn't Devilman related. And Devilman, I didn't feel that any anime adaptation specifically overtook Elfin Lead, just because none of them I feel like are as good as the Elfin Lead anime, though they are all good in their own right. Elfin Lead is a controversial one. It's super gory, it's over the top. It's about this mutant that's like the next step in human evolution, and she's very misanthropic. She wants to kill people, she wants to wipe out humanity because she sees us as subhuman, because humans didn't treat her very well growing up, and it's very dark, and it deals a lot with sort of a nihilistic view on people and seeing people as less than human, and as everyone having sort of this inner dark side to them. Again, it's one of the goriest animes that people talk about. I definitely wouldn't say it's the goriest anime. The gore is all there in the manga as well, obviously. The manga's better than the anime. It shares a similar thing with Man Wonderland, where they just kind of stopped halfway through on the anime adaptation. Though I don't think it's as egregious as it was in Man Wonderland, because at least in the anime they kind of gave it an ending for Elfin Lead. Elfin Lead was actually one that wasn't available officially in English for a very long time. Just a year or two ago they started bringing it here in the US, and I remember doing a video the second they started doing that. I read it all online years ago, mind you. It was another manga I read fairly early on. Basically, with manga, I read Death Note, Elfin Lead, then Violence Jack, and then after that I started reading a hell of a lot more manga, because again, I was a lot more into anime than I was manga. But yeah, Elfin Lead's great. It's gory, it's controversial, and it's dark and sad. But yeah, it's great. I recommend checking it out. It's very over the top, with a lot of nudity and violence, though, so do bear that in mind. Let's move on to number 2. Alright, number 2. Now, this might shock a lot of you that this is only number 2. But again, if you've watched all of my manga reviews, it maybe won't surprise you that much. But that's the original Devilman. Devilman is my favorite manga franchise. And it's my favorite anime franchise. All the Devilman anime collectively put together make my favorite anime, but individually they don't stand out enough to be number 1, though they are all in my top 10 in that regard. As far as the manga goes, however, the original Devilman manga is one of my all-time favorites. Like I said, it's number 2 on this list for a reason. But Devilman is this dark battle shonen sort of thing that becomes a lot more fucked up and depressing and, like, becomes a tragedy by the end of it, where it breaks a lot of the norms with battle shonen, because it sort of starts out as a regular battle shonen where Akira Fudo, a high school student, fuses with a demon to fight other demons. And he's going around fighting these demons, and they make you think it's going to be just this episodic monster of the week sort of thing, similarly to how the 70s adaptation was with the anime. But then they start having it get really fucking dark and tragic and killing off characters and making things take a major turn south, and things start getting really depressing. And that's what I love about it. I'm not going to spoil the ending here, but the ending to the original Devilman manga is my favorite ending to anything. I love the ending to Devilman. Again, very bittersweet and tragic, and that's what I love about it. And it's not the ending you expect when you first start reading it, but I think that the ending is really what makes it great. Not to say that the earlier chapters aren't great, because they absolutely are, and it has a great cast of characters, too. There's a couple of areas where I think that the development could have been better with some of the characters. I do think subsequent adaptations, spin-offs, and remakes have kind of rectified that, so that's why I look at the whole series as a whole as my favorite, but individually not as much. But there's a reason I've done over 100 videos on Devilman. It's my favorite manga and anime franchise, and I would argue probably my favorite fictional universe. But that said, there is one manga that on its own I do think is better than the original Devilman manga and is my favorite manga of all time. So let's talk about number 1, and it's fitting that it's number 1 because it's in the title of it, Ichi the Killer. Now, Ichi the Killer is a very, very controversial manga. It's been adapted into a movie, and the movie itself is also very controversial. Don't get me wrong, I love the movie, but the manga's so much better, and it's also so much more fucked up. I read the manga before I even knew the movie existed, and then I watched the movie afterwards, and I still enjoyed the movie a hell of a lot. But the movie changes the ending, it removes some of the more fucked up stuff. Now granted, it's still fucked up, but it tones it down a little bit. There's also an OVA prequel to the movies that is based on the prequel manga Ichi, which I don't like as much. But the reason I say Ichi the Killer has 1 right in the title, if you don't know, Ichi literally just means 1. And the thing I like about Ichi the Killer is, so first off, it's a story about a bunch of Yakuza stuff, right? There's a lot of Yakuza characters that start getting killed off by this mysterious hitman known only as Ichi. And Ichi is an adult man who has more or less the mind of a child and is constantly getting easily manipulated by this mysterious old man simply known only as Jiji. Which, if you don't know, Jiji literally just means old man in Japanese. There's definitely a lot more behind Jiji that they don't reveal in the manga, and I love it because it makes you start questioning, wait, what the fuck, who is this guy? Because Jiji has this mysterious backstory behind him and a lot of twists and stuff towards the end that I'm not going to spoil. I remember reading it, and I'm like, this is fucking cool. And I remember at the time saying it was the most fucked up manga I'd ever read. This was obviously before I had discovered the Irogoro genre. Ichi the Killer itself, although I don't think it's technically classified as a hentai, I would think it definitely is in many regards, because there's a lot of violence in this. It got really fucked up, like rape scenes, violence, gore, genital mutilation, cutting out tongues, decapitation, losing an arm, nipples getting sliced off. It's really fucking violent. But the whole thing is this fascinating crime story about the Yakuza being torn apart by this man-child who's being controlled by this mysterious old man, and he's being hunted down by this Yakuza boss named Kakihara, who's a complete and total masochist and loves to get hurt, and meanwhile Ichi himself is a total sadist, so the two kind of balance each other out, and they're destined to, like, fight at the end. It's fucking great. It's really fucked up, so it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's easily my favorite manga of all time. I really wish it would get an official English release, because I would buy it like that. Absolutely love Ichi the Killer, and I really wish there was like an anime adaptation to it. That said, the manga's great. Hopefully it gets a US release one day by like 7 Seas or somebody. But yeah, that's my video on my top 10 favorite manga. I hope you've enjoyed the list. Let me know in the comments what your top 10 manga is, if you agreed with any of the stuff I said or if you disagreed. I think I've got a fairly unique set of tastes, so I completely don't expect anyone to 100% fully agree. But, you know, if you want to be special and pretend you do, great. That'd be fucking fantastic. Anyway, this has been Fugitive Red. I hope you've enjoyed. Toodles.